my name's Ammie, and you know me as the school counsellor, the lead counsellor at JESS. But in a previous life, I didn't work in schools. I used to work in the prison service, and I've worked in 3 different prisons, and that really showed a lot of different things, very different to here. Wonderful, really enjoyed it, but you know, in terms of the difference, I guess there's more hope. In school there's a lot of hope. We're at the beginning, there's loads of things we can do and change, but when you get to prison, you know, something's gone horribly wrong in your life. So one of the prisons I worked in was HMP Manchester, or what you've probably known as Strangeways if you are from the UK. So Strangeways is a category A prison. That's the highest category you can go. So what that means is you have some of the worst criminals, and that might not just be in terms of what they've done. So yes, you might have a serial killer, but also it means in terms of their means. So you'll have one of the wings will be specifically for very high risk prisoners that have the means to escape. Because if you're very rich, you might even be able to get a helicopter to come and pick you up from the landing, you know. So you want to make sure that these prisoners are really well confined. They can't go in open areas for reasons like helicopters. Nowadays drones are such a problem. You know, they could be giving things over the wall, but also we even dress them up. We made, like, the prisoners that were a big escape risk, we literally made them look like clowns. So everyone else would just be in a normal prisoner uniform. They would be dressed from head to toe in like stripes, so everyone could see like straight away, yeah, you know, make sure he's not going anywhere. So in terms of the ones that were notorious for us that we had Harold Shipman, who is probably one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. He killed way over 200 plus people. Horrible, really, really vile individual, of course. So he went to Manchester prison, but he couldn't stay there because he used to be a doctor in his practice, and he mainly killed old people. In terms of why, we're not entirely sure. There's some theories that, you know, he was literally playing God. There's some theories that he was avenging his mother's death. She died when he was 17. There's other theories, you know, he was actually trying to support their suffering, so it was mainly older people. So it's old people. So he was put in Manchester prison, but he had to be on a different wing again for his own protection. Because if you can imagine, if you've been prolifically killing that many people in Manchester area, some of the other prisoners and some of the prison officers are going to have relatives that were your victims. That doesn't leave you in a very safe place. So Shipman was really rather at risk. He didn't stay at Manchester. He was transferred out once he was convicted and put in Wakefield for his own safety. But we could never really get to the bottom of why he did those awful things, because he did kill himself eventually, maybe playing God with himself, who knows. So yeah, it's difficult. Someone like that you probably think is probably a psychopath. Psychopaths make up about only 1% of the population in general, but a much higher percent of the population once you reach prison, probation, police services. They're very highly known. So psychopaths are people that don't show empathy, don't show remorse, they have flattened affect. Affect is just a posh word for feelings. They can't feel things in the same way as us. They often have grandiose ideas of themselves, hence they're playing God. So they're the ones that are really difficult to rehabilitate. And you know, my role's always been about rehabilitation. I do believe everybody can change. I think with a psychopath, with a true psychopath with that personality, that's very hard. That is, you know, that actually skews some of the data in prisons. When you look at whether people can change, some of the people that you put on, say, rehabilitation programs will be psychopaths, and they are virtually untreatable once you get to adult age. If the psychopathic tendencies in childhood, there are much more things that you can do to prevent them reaching that level. But once in adulthood, it's really hard. So, for example, when I was in Manchester, another notorious prisoner was Dale Cregan. He was a vile human being. He killed a couple of people, but in a very different way to Shipman. So not a serial killer, but in one of the notorious gangs in Manchester. So the gangs would be running drugs, you know, they would be intimidating people, and they would be both competing for for the money, for the resources, and they did that through fear. Hideous people. So this gang rivalry grew and grew between these two families, and Dale Cregan ends up killing someone around his own age that was in a rival gang. But then he feared. It was a pretty explosive killing. It was in a pub, shot them, shot some other people too, but they didn't die. Then he was in fear for his own life. Of course, gang retaliation, what's going to happen? So you can see how this, if you get into that culture, life is not easy. Life was pretty awful for Dale Cregan. Not that I have too much sympathy for him. So he always feared that this boy's dad was going to come after him. So what does he do? He wants to get there first. So he ended up killing the dad as well. And he had like a calling card of he'd shoot, but then he'd throw a grenade afterwards. What made him really hateful, and when he was again put in prison, he went on the run for a while, but when he was caught and put in prison eventually, what made him risk for himself was he also killed 2 female police officers. So, of course, the prison officers do not want people killing police officers. That really is very close to home. Again, there's a risk that he might even be beaten up by someone, a vigilante there. But yeah, so he killed the 2 police officers, and that was a really vile killing, because he actually lured them. He pretended there was a burglary at a house, and then he threw a grenade, and they both died. And then, again, in terms of justification, why on earth did he do it? Getting into the criminal mind. This guy was a psychopath. He does not feel the same emotions that we do. He does not feel remorse. And the only reason he could ever come out with was that, they were hounding my family, because of course he was on the run and trying to get away. They were hounding my family, so I wanted their families to feel bad. Right, thanks. But again, with him being a sort of psychopath, there was a lot of grandiose big sort of God complex there, and of course he ruled through fear. He wanted people to fear him. Was he happy? No, I'm sure he was not happy. This isn't like a wonderful path you go down, and life was pretty difficult for him afterwards. But so not everyone in prison is absolutely notorious, and not everyone in prison can't reform. I remember one of the boys that I worked with that always touched me, because I just thought how difficult. This was a young man who'd grown up in a really difficult part of Manchester called Moss Side, which is poor, rough, lots of drugs, lots of gangs, very difficult. He'd not from a particularly great background, not stable by any means, and his he went in a pub brawl, but he was carrying a knife at the time. So he got the knife out, stabbed someone, but it was a fatal stabbing, and then he lost his life as well through being sentenced for murder. And just working with someone like that, that's just kind of, he's not a psychopath. He does feel complete remorse for what has happened. This is just, it's tragic, because the life he's lost, as well as the victim, and as well as the victim's family, is just absolutely devastating. And I remember we did a rehabilitation program with him and 12 other offenders. He was the youngest there. He'd only just come up. He'd been in a juvenile estate. And at the end, I was sort of, giving a little speech to give him the certificate, and saying all the wonderful things that he'd done really well, and how, we really were impressed with lots of his thinking and learning and stuff. And he started crying. And he was just so sort of emotional about it, and you could see that actually he just had never really had that before. He'd never had, parents or teachers or anyone that supported him and said good stuff about him. So I believe he'll go on and will be able to reform. But it just shows you those paths that we lead. Some of which we can't determine ourselves, but some of which are determined by the choices we make. And at the time, he probably didn't view he had a choice. He was probably carrying a knife for his own protection due to where he lived and how unsafe he felt. That was his social norm. But how sad is that? Because that decision to bring that knife out on that day not only ruined the other person's life, but ruined his own too. So, it just sort of being able to stop and think and look at our lives in that way is just so important. So there's only one other thing. Whenever I get asked about, life in the prison service, people always say, were you ever scared? Because there's all these dangerous criminals around you. I would say I wasn't scared in the male estates I worked in because, you know, the male prisoners, there is a hierarchy, there's a code among prisoners anyway about what sort of offences they deem worse, better, not. They're still quite sort of protective over females, you know, so if there ever was a fight, you know, I would slam an alarm bell, prison officers would rush in, and, you know, a prisoner would usually stand and make sure I was being, you know, not hurt. They were quite good. But the only time that I did fear for my own safety was in a female young offenders institute with this young woman who, well, I think she'd had a lot of stimulants in her time, so her brain was fried, and she'd put in lots of referrals to kind of get help and see me. And then when I you know, answered them, here you are, come in, she'd totally forgotten that she'd asked to see me at all. So she was as if it was like brand new information. What am I doing here? What have you called me for? And then she was really, really aggressive. And then I learnt that, you know, her offence had been bringing a machete into a shop with the shopkeeper. And I was like, oh God, I was sitting here thinking, where's the alarm bell? Oh, I've set on the wrong side. The alarm bell's near her. How am I going to get out? The door's near her. I've set this up really badly. Anyway, so we went through the conversation, really placated her, made it nice and easy, and she calmed down. And then by the very end, I said, right, okay, well, if you do want to see me again, you know, do put in a referral. And we stood up, and then she leaned over the table, and I thought, oh no. And then she actually leant in and hugged me. I was like, oh, right, okay, it's a hug, we're fine, we're good now. But yes, just that's the only time I actually worried for my safety. Most of the time, you're very safe, and it is actually a wonderful place to work. I really enjoyed it so much.